The Story of Civilization, Part 2. The Life of Greece, being a history of Greek civilization from the beginnings and of civilization in the Near East from the death of Alexander to the Roman conquest, with an introduction on the prehistoric culture of Crete by Durant. Chapter 8 is called The Gods of Greece. Section 4 is called Worship. Greek ritual was as varied as the kinds of deities that it honored. The Chthonian received a gloomy ritual of appeasement and riddance. The Olympians, a joyful ritual of welcome and praise. Neither form of ceremony required a clergyman. The father acted as priest for the family, the chief magistrate for the state. Life in Greece was not as secular as it has been described. Religion played a major part in it everywhere, and each government protected the official cult as vital to social order and political stability. But whereas in Egypt and the Near East, the priesthood dominated the state, in Greece, the state dominated the priesthood, took the leadership of religion, reduced the clergy to minor functionaries in the temples. The property of the temples in real estate, money, and slaves was audited and administered by officials of the state. There were no seminaries for the training of priests. Anyone could be quietly chosen or appointed priest if he knew the rites of the god. And in many places, the office was let out to the highest bidder. There was no hierarchy of priestly caste. The priest of one temple or state had usually no association with those of another. There was no church, no orthodoxy, no rigid creed. Religion consisted not in professing certain beliefs, but in joining in the official ritual. Any man might have his own creed provided that he did not openly deny or blaspheme the city's gods. In Greece, church and state were one. In the Islamic world, you can go to any masjid, and regardless of what sect you are, you can pray together, you can go on pilgrimage, you can do the fasting and the charity and all that together. And if you have some slight different interpretations in one way or another, tends to be things after Muhammad died, then, it's fine, you can do your thing. But in general, if people stay out of those arguments, then, But that idea of church and state is not like this. There's no enforcement of blasphemy laws in the Islamic world. In Christianity and Judaism, there is. The place of worship could be the domestic hearth, which is part of where people get the idea of heathen from, is, them heathens don't even go to church. The municipal hearth in the city hall, some cleft in the earth for a Chthonian entity, some temple for an Olympian entity. The precincts of the temple were sacred and inviolable. Here the worshippers met, and here all pursued persons, even if tainted with serious crime, could find sanctuary. The temple was not for the congregation, but for the entity that was treated as a god. There, in his home, his statue was erected, and a light burned before it, which was not allowed to die. Often the people identified the god with the statue. They washed, dressed, and tended the image carefully, and sometimes scolded it for negligence. They told how at various times the statue had sweated, or wept, or closed its eyes. In the temple records, a history was kept of the festivals of the god and of the major events in the life of the city or group that worshipped him. This was the source and first form of Greek historiography. The ceremony consisted of procession, chants, sacrifice, prayer, and sometimes a sacred meal. Magic and masquerade, tableau, and dramatic representations might be part of the procession. In most cases, the basic ritual was prescribed by custom, and every movement of it Every word of the hymns and prayers was preserved in a book kept sacred by the family or the state. Rarely was any syllable or action altered, or any rhythm. God might not like or comprehend the novelty. The living speech changed, the ritual speech remained as before. In time, the worshippers ceased to understand the words they used, but the thrill of antiquity supplied the place of understanding. Often the ceremony outlasted even the memory of the cause that had prompted it. Then new myths were invented to explain its establishment. The myth or creed might change, but not the ritual. Music was essential to the whole process, for without music, religion would be difficult. Well, not really. If you think that's instruments outside the human body, it actually becomes easier when you adapt to sacred chant and all that. Music generates religion as much as religion generates music. Out of the temple and processional chants came poetry, and the meters that later adorned the robust profanity of Archilochus, the reckless passion of Sappho, and the scandalous delicacies of Anacreon. Having reached the altar, usually in front of the temple, the worshippers sought with sacrifice and prayer to avert the wrath or win the aid of what they considered to be a god. As individuals, they might offer almost anything of value: statues, reliefs, furniture, weapons, cauldrons, tripods, garments, pottery. When the entities could make no use of such articles, the priests could. Armies might offer part of their spoils, as Xenophon's 10,000 did in their retreat. Groups would offer the fruits of the field. The vines are trees. More often, an animal appetizing to what they consider to be a god, or at least attributed in that direction. Because sometimes it would have turned out that such and such entity wouldn't have been pleased just because some particular animal. Sometimes on occasions of great need, a human being. In Plutarch's Lives, I don't know how many human sacrifices I mentioned just in going over that book. Agamemnon offered Iphigenia for a wind. Achilles slaughtered 12 Trojan youths on the pyre of Patroclus. Human victims were hurled from the cliffs of Cyprus and Leucas to satiate Apollo. Others were presented to Dionysus in Chios and Tenedos. Themistocles is said to have sacrificed Persian captives to Dionysus at the Battle of Salamis. The Spartans celebrated the festival of Artemis Orthia by flogging youths, sometimes to death, at her altar. In Arcadia, Zeus received human sacrifice till the 2nd century of the Common Era. At Massalia, in time of pestilence, one of the poorer citizens was fed at public expense, clad in holy garments, decorated with sacred boughs, and cast over a cliff to death with prayers that he might bear punishment for all the sins of his people. In Athens, it was the custom in famine, plague, or other crisis to offer to the gods ritual mimicry or an actual fact, one or more scapegoats for the purification of the city, and a similar rite, mimic or literal, was annually performed at the festival of Thargelia. In the course of time, human sacrifice was mitigated by restricting its victims to condemned criminals and dulling their senses with wine. Finally, it was replaced by the sacrifice of an animal, when on the night before the battle of Leuctra, 371 BCE, the Boeotian leader, Pelopidas, had a dream that seemed to demand a human sacrifice at the altar as the price of victory. Some of his counselors advised it, but others protested against it, saying that such a barbarous and impious obligation could not be pleasing to any supreme being, that Typhons and giants did not preside over the world, but the general father of gods and mortals, that it was absurd to imagine any divinities and powers delighting in slaughter and sacrifice of men. Who was it? Chemalaus? Was he the one that really hit down on that point? Animal sacrifice, then, was a major step in the development of civilization. The beast who bore the brunt of this advance in Greece were the bull, the sheep, and the pig. Before any battle, the rival armies sent up sacrifices in proportion to their desired victory. Before any assembly in Athens, the meeting place was purified by the sacrifice of a pig. That's a great symbol for government nowadays, right? The piety of the people, however, broke down at the crucial point. Only the bones and a little flesh, wrapped in fat, went to what was considered to be the god. The rest was kept for the priests and the worshippers. Well, see, in India, that was the thing too. The sacred meal was the flesh of the animal or whatever edibles were offered. To excuse themselves, the Greeks told how, in the days of the giants, Prometheus had wrapped the edible portions of the sacrificial animal in skin and the bones in fat, and had asked Zeus to choose which he preferred. Zeus had with both hands chosen the fat. It was true that Zeus was enraged upon finding that he had been deceived, but he had made his choice and must abide by it forever. Only in sacrifice to the Chthonian was everything surrendered to the deity, and the entire animal burnt to ashes in a holocaust. The divinities of the lower world were more feared than those of Olympus. And remember, that's how the Bible says to do the sacrifices too, is that the whole animal is used. Some parts are burnt and the rest is divided amongst the worshippers. But there are other reasons to think that they're the underground sort of entities, that type of worship is specifically addressed in the worship of Yahweh. The victims in Athens were called pharmakoi, which originally meant magicians. Pharmakon meant a magic spell or formula, then a healing drug. The question whether the pharmakoi were really slain is in dispute, but there is a little doubt that the sacrifice was originally literal. And remember in the Bible that when they have that in Greek, the idea is with the person who practiced this wasn't allowed to live. Now, you could use whatever substances you were using for health and healing religiously, but some other things were implied there. Like, for example, the idea that you had to get high and go on some sort of spiritual journey, or the person or the doctor did or something. That was what was being addressed. No common meal followed a chthonic sacrifice, for that might tempt the entity to come and join the feast, but after sacrifice to the Olympians, the worshippers, not in odd atonement to the entity, but in joyous communion with them, consumed the consecrated victim. The magic formulas pronounced over it had, they hoped, imbued it with the life and power of the entity, which would now pass mystically into his communicants. In like manner, wine was poured upon the sacrifice, and then into the cups of the worshippers, who drank, so to speak, with the gods. In the Theasoi, or fraternities, into which so many trade and social groups in Athens were organized, this idea of divine communication in a common religious meal formed the binding tie. Animal sacrifice continued throughout Greece until ended by Christianity, which wisely substituted for it the spiritual and symbolic sacrifice of the Mass. Well, that's not what Jesus commanded in the Bible. The Bible has Jesus command animal sacrifice and say that he came to restore the law. So the conservative extras and the liberal takeaways or replacements, that was what the biblical Jesus was dealing with. The theological concept of Jesus, that's where we went down those lines. And then Paul, of course, was trying to decide what the new law was, and then they went back and did, like, theological Jesus to adapt that a bit. In some measure, prayer too became a substitute for sacrifice. It was a clever amendment that commuted offerings of blood into litanies of praise. In this gentler way, man, subject to chance and tragedy at every step, consoled and strengthened himself by calling to his aid the mysterious powers of the world.